I got curious. And I have a really strong curiosity streak. I got curious. I met someone at a networking event at a Chamber of Commerce and several of the other networking groups in Maryland, where I hail from. And I started going by his business. I referred some business to him. And I just couldn't figure out why a man as smart as he was ran his businesses the way that he did. There was just stuff that didn't make sense to my brain. So I found out that you can barter for a lot of things. And he had some projects that weren't getting done. And my daughter needed a car. So he happened to have a dealership. So I bartered for a car. So I was there trying to figure this out. It didn't take me long. This is from the casebook, and it is the case of the reluctant club owner. Okay, the ballpark theory has a club owner who sets the rules of the ballpark and a ball player whose job it is to figure out which option they're going to be in and obey the rules. Well, what we had here was a case of a club owner who was showing up to work dressed in the attitudes and habits of a ball player. There was chaos. Since nobody was setting the rules, nobody knew what to do, and not much was getting done. Now, this blew the water out of my first theory, okay? Because I had my theories, and I've read a lot of books, and there's a book called Do It. And Do It had this theory in it that I loved. It says, if you're not playing a big enough game, you will screw it up just to have something to do. And I was sure that that's what was going on with this guy. But that wasn't it. What was happening was that nobody had given him the club owner manual. This is what happens when an entrepreneur grows their business to the point that they need to manage employees. He'd never had management training for all his MBAs and other degrees, and he'd owned this company for long enough to have messed it up multiple times. Yeah. Some people can take anyone into their organization and turn them into a good employee. He wasn't one of those. He could take anyone into his organization and turn them into a bad, unmotivated, disengaged employee. Because if you don't provide direction, then nobody knows what to do. So when we talked about ballparks and what ballpark you spend the most time in, this is where I said this week we're going to start with, is it your ballpark? If it's your ballpark, what are the rules? Are the rules written down? So we all have our ballparks, okay? Sometimes we have them at work even if we don't own the company, because we have our little division that we have absolute control over, whether it's customer service or whether it's herding cats, which is my definition of managing volunteers. Whatever it is that you're in control over, that's your ballpark that you set the rules in. But do you know what the rules are? Are they written down? That's the second question. What are the rules? Are they written down? When it came to being in control of my own house, my own household, it never dawned on me to write the rules down. And I think I shared in the overview video, I don't remember if I said it last week, but it took me a long time to realize that, when I went to visit my mom, I was going into her ballpark. But when she came to my house, whose ballpark was she in? It took me years to figure that out, because she would come to my house and I would try to change everything to make her more comfortable. There's that doormat to diamond idea is kind of under there somewhere. I won't go digging too deeply today. It was not pretty when she came to my house, because my kids were confused. My husband was upset because how we normally lived was being disrupted. Not necessarily because my mother insisted, but because I did. I had never claimed my ballpark. And I had never lived alone. So if you've never lived alone, you know, I mean, for me, I went from living at my mom's to being married, and I never lived alone. So it had never dawned on me to create the rules. You know, they just sort of, everybody else had rules. That was fine. You know, I was very accommodating. And when I understood that it was my ballpark, I went, oh, I could have rules. What would my rules look like? Now, coming into my ballpark, she had 3 choices. She could accept the rules without conflict, adhere to the rules with conflict, or stay out of my ballpark. But I didn't tell her that I was claiming my ballpark. I just did. And all that happened, amazingly, all that happened was the conversation changed. And now it was, yes, Mom, I know you want to watch the TV show at 7:30. We have to be on the ball field at 6:30 for practice. Do you want to come with us or stay here and watch TV? Yes, Mom, I know you like to have breakfast at 8. We have breakfast at 7. Would you like oatmeal or eggs? No problem. She had choices, no stress on my side. It didn't take her too long. And even without knowing the ballpark theory, she chose option 3. She quit coming to visit. My husband at the time was ecstatic. And because I was in option 1 when I went to visit her, so that, yeah, there was no conflict. We had a great time when I would go to visit her. She didn't come to visit me. Everybody was happy. Who knew it could be so simple? Yeah. And it lasted that way through the rest of her life. Most of my visits were completely free from any dramatic stress. So very, very different than when I was adhering to her rules. So it makes a huge difference. The real challenge with this, though, okay, as we move forward, and this is where we're going to go next, is if you're not clear about your rules, if you're not absolutely crystal clear about the 3 questions, I've given you 2. The first one is, what are the rules? This is actually 4, because the first one is it my ballpark? Then it's, what are the rules? Are the rules written down? And here's the big one. Are they applied equally to everybody in the ballpark? As appropriate, okay? I mean, we're not going to ask a 2-year-old to clean up after themselves. But are we cleaning up after an 18-year-old? Yeah. Are they being applied in a way that's appropriate? So we won't say equally, we'll say appropriately. Claiming your ballparks. So when you get a chance, you can start figuring out where you're in control, where you're the club owner, and where you're not in control, where you're in somebody else's ballpark. And now I'm going to finish my story. The reluctant club owner showing up with the attitudes and habits of a ball player and creating havoc and destroying employee after employee. The underlying problem. He wanted to retire. He didn't want to be there. Well, if the boss doesn't want to be there, imagine what that does to the morale of everybody else who works there. He had to absolutely convince me that he was ready to retire. And when he did, I said, okay, this is what I'm going to do. This is how long it's going to take. We're going to get you retired. And the first thing I did, I hired an acting club owner. Got him out of the management role completely and made it possible for him to then retire. You have to know what you want. And that's really where we started last week, was what is so good in your life that you want more of it? So I'm going to bring you back to that question. Now that we know that the club owner got what he wanted, and I'm going to give you full disclosure, okay? What he wanted was to retire, not just anywhere. He wanted to retire to Sarasota, Florida, because he'd been coming down here on vacation for almost his entire life since he was in his 20s. Now, there are some interesting things about entrepreneurs. He got down here retired. because by the time I was done, the company is sold, the commercial property was sold, the house, all of it. He's down here. And he's retired for 3 months. And he calls me. He saw an ad in the paper. Commercial property for sale, 3 buildings, rental income, and a phone number. So he called, he goes to visit. The guy was selling the property and closing the businesses that he had had on this property for 30, 38 years. It was the same 2 companies that I had just gotten him out of in Maryland. So he says, calls me, famous words. If you buy it, I will kill you. Because I had spent 18 months getting those companies sold. So he bought it, and I came down and changed the locks on the doors and hired managers, because he didn't want to work 24/7. So I went back to Maryland. Came back and fired managers, hired more managers, went back to Maryland. A few years later, I'm in Florida more than I'm in Maryland, minding my own company. And I'm like, who are we kidding? So when people say, how did I get to Florida? I followed a man. And I'm still with him. So, and yes, he still owns a used car dealership. But I don't run it, and neither does he now. So we call this semi-retired. We'll call it a happy ending because that's what I'm choosing to call it. And we really can choose. What we name the thing is important. So the reality is that he's still a lousy club owner. And so we keep him out of the office as much as possible, because you just have to accept people for who they are. You know, when you can accept people for who they are, then you can start figuring out workarounds. But this is really the ballpark theory in action, because if it's not inside your skin, it's not under your control. And that means you've only got 3 choices. You either accept them without conflict, you adhere, you hang around with them, but you're in conflict with them, wanting them to be different, or you stay out of the way. You let them stay out of your life. Sanity is when you get discernment. And by the end of this course, you'll have some discernment. And what that looks like when you have discernment is when people show you who they are, you believe them the first time. So that's the gift of discernment. When people show you who they are, you believe them the first time. Yeah, interesting thought. All right, so I'm going to pull back, make sure I didn't miss any of the rules. Phones off, no sarcasm, no stories except mine. And yeah, the no stories is, of course, not talking about the things that you haven't healed. Okay, not going to where the emotion is crappy, where you could re-traumatize yourself. And 0 complaining. And we talked a little bit about creative complaining and the book, How to Stop Smiling and Start Vetching. It's help for the chronically cheerful. There are a few people in the room who might need to read this one.
What was the name again?
It's called How to Stop Smiling and Start Vetching, KVETCH. And the first part of the book is how to pronounce that word. Yeah. So, help for the chronically cheerful. The strategies in there for creative complaining are worth reading. And if you haven't picked your book for the 5x5 practice, feel free to start with that one. That's an excellent book to start with. Okay, so now we're to a blank page. And we're going to take a 2-minute break.